Hardcore Diablo is not for the faint of heart, and in Diablo 4, hardcore is really fun considering how the game is designed, but that's for a different video. What you are interested in today is to make sure that your sorcerer can play hardcore on veteran 2 or maybe even higher without actually dying. And you will want to do a lot of big damage, and you might want some gear as well, and this is tested and proven. I have played it through my first playthrough of Diablo 4. I didn't know anything that was gonna happen, didn't know any of the bosses, didn't know any of the mechanics or any of the quests, and I've never died once. Of course, this was tested on beta, so things might end up changing, but as it stands right now, this is probably how you're going to want to build your sorcerer starting your hardcore, unless you find some really cool legendaries or maybe some new builds will be discovered in the future. But until then, and until future videos that we will give you, this is how you do it. First off, a couple of items that you might want to take into consideration. Of course, they are legendary or at least aspects, and it kind of matters a little bit on your luck. However, playing through a bunch of hours, and not that much to be honest, I've managed to loot these a couple of times, so they're not necessarily hard to get, and especially if you have the obols to gamble for specific item slots, you will pretty much guaranteed get at least one of these items. First of all, the recharging ring, which I have looted twice, so it's not that uncommon. It makes Chain Lightning give you 4 mana when it bounces off of yourself, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. This is really good for bosses and for, you know, single target elites where you don't have a lot of targets for Chain Lightning to bounce off of, and it will essentially bounce off of you a lot, giving you a lot of mana back, so you can just fire more and more Chain Lightnings. Serpentine Adventurer Gloves is a really good item, and it definitely enables the build. It lets you spawn 1 extra Hydra than normal. However, the Hydras do last 25% less, which is not necessarily a problem considering that most things die before the Hydra goes away, and if they don't, you can resummon it, and it will actually work really well for you to have to resummon it, considering the Hydra is a spell that you really want to reposition as you progress through the level, dungeon, whatever you are, or how the mobs are chasing you down. If you are running away from them and trying to kite, you probably will want to occasionally respawn or reposition your Hydra, so them lasting less is not particularly bad. The third item that I would strongly recommend, especially for hardcore, is Vigo's Protective Amulet. This is unfortunately unlocked all throughout the quest, although it's not necessarily a problem because you don't really need it by the time you actually get through the point where you get it, and after you get it, more and more of the game will be unlocked with more difficult stuff like strongholds, and maybe even the world boss can be accessible after you get this, so this is kind of necessary. It really helps you out until you find something else better. And what this does is essentially once you get hit while you're not healthy, meaning that when you're below 80% HP, you will spawn a big ass barrier. It's very similar to what you've encountered by doing the story and unlocking this amulet, and inside it you are immune to everything, damage, CC, everything. And obviously this, you can time this with a lot of resource building or getting your cooldowns back, and you can rotate this with ice armor and other stuff to make sure that you never really die in a hardcore setting. And the last bit is something that dropped a little bit later for me, around level 25 I think, or level 24, is the Rapid Loop, which is an overpowered item, so unless this gets nerfed, this is going to be crazy, making your basic attacks have a 33 or 30% attack speed. This is nuts, and it does really work well. It can probably enable a lot of other builds and a lot of other basic abilities, but as it stands, the one we're going to be using it on is part of this build. And speaking of the build, what you will like to have by the end of level, let's say 24, 25, where kind of I've been able to unlock all of this, is Arc Clash. You'll probably want to put 3 points in, although not very necessary at the beginning of the game, since you won't rely too much on Arc Clash and things will probably die very quick by the time you manage to spam this a lot. The next thing, obviously, you'll get Enhanced Arc Clash, which obviously you will need to unlock Chain Lightning, in which you will put 5 points eventually. And the reason I say eventually is because a lot of these points will require you multiple points investments, and you don't really need to start putting them unless you start to see that your damage requires a little bit of a bump, when you can instead pick other stuff that will increase your survivability. And we'll get to that in a second. The second thing that you want to take into consideration is Enhanced Chain Lightning. Obviously, you have to take this, and there are two kind of capstones for the chain lightning, and you can only pick one clearly because they, offset each other, and you can swap between the two. The greater chain lightning is actually really good on bosses, where when it bounces off of yourself, it does 25% more damage, and the other one, destructive chain lightning, is really good for AoE and trash, and it definitely helps since, greater chain lightning is not that amazing when fighting multiple mobs. And now we're going into some utility, which you can access a little bit earlier than having to put, let's say, 5 points to chain lightning. And the first one you'll probably get, everybody and their mom is getting, is teleport. 1 point here is amazing, lets you traverse distances, obviously, which is very useful, lets you get out of sticky situations, which is also very useful. And probably the best thing that teleport does is you can cast it when you're crowd controlled. Whether you're stunned, feared, slowed, rooted, or anything, you can cast teleport and break out of it. That is amazing for hardcore, because that's usually when you will die the most, is when you're getting mobbed down by a big group of enemies and you're just surrounded, or you're basically stunned or CC'd while they wail on you, which is not ideal. The second ability that will provide you with a decent defensiveness, and I strongly recommend you take, is Ice Armor. Also only 1 point here. It's pretty self-explanatory. It provides you with a barrier that absorbs damage that you take to the face, and as it is active on you, on top of other bonuses that it can give, the damage that you do is transferred into its absorb shield, and you can essentially stay still and just cast a bunch of stuff and have all of it be absorbed by Ice Armor. And it doesn't last long, so it's probably good to be used for something like that. The other next ability that you want to get, which is kind of really crucial for the build, at least later on, is Hydra. And you want to put at least 4 points into it. Since the build was tested in beta and past level 25, I couldn't put more points than 4 in it because I didn't have the leftover points, but obviously you can max this. This is obviously really good. It provides you with a lot of the damage, and it kind of rounds up the build. Enhanced Hydra is a pretty much no-brainer, and you can get even one of the capstones, which is Summoned Hydra. That's particularly really good for bosses. The other one is a little bit iffy. It's probably way better endgame when you actually have a bunch more crit, but until then, probably Summoned Hydra is the best. Then you can take a couple of filler points. Static Discharge, you can put 1 to 3 points in it. It's really good for your lightning enablers. Shocking Impact is also really good as you're building up towards the build. You can start to put 3 points, but I have started moving away from it, and it ended up with 0 points investment later on. But as you're starting off, it's probably going to be really good. And of course, Inferno, your ultimate ability, which is a really good crowd control ability. It definitely helps you kind of pack the mobs together, and it provides you with easy way to maneuver around a pack so you don't necessarily get chunked and killed. Then there are a couple of bonus things to mention, depending on how you want to spend your points, depending on how you want to unlock these as you level up, because these will be very dependent on your own experience and what you feel like you need, depending on how lucky you are with the gear. First of all, Align the Elements is a tankiness node. It's a passive node that just provides you with damage reduction against elites when you don't take damage from them for a certain amount of time. This is really good, especially if you play a kite style playstyle, which is definitely what this build is, and of course is probably what most hardcore playstyle will be for a range caster, specifically sorcerer as well. So it does work really well, and it has helped me clear some more dangerous bosses. Elemental Attunement is worth 1 point for the potential defensiveness reset that it can have. I mean, you can probably play the RNG and put more points in it if you want to, but I found out that 1 point and just the occasional reset is good enough for me. And of course, if you really are lacking some defensives and survivability, Frost Nova is probably going to be your go-to. It's a good crowd control ability in case you start to get surrounded. You definitely want to use it to prevent that, although it can enable other stuff as well that can work for your build. Even though you're not main Frost, it can also enable vulnerability and stuff like that. Spark and Enhanced Spark and Flickering Spark can be an alternative to your Arc Lash, especially for early crackling energy farming, which works with a bunch of other bonus options here that I mentioned. And it can be really good to get a little bit of burst of damage when you don't have a lot of gear to like just stay in combat for a long time. And like I mentioned, Invigorating Conduit can be at any point investment depending on how much you want. I've actually played with all three and it's actually really good, and it gives you a lot of crackling energy to zap your way into the combat. And lastly, Precision Magic is also really good for early crackling farming, because you do want to, bank up on this lucky hit strikes and the critical strikes, which is really good, possibly being even better late game. And as you continuously level, you can continuously unlock more and more points. This is kind of core as to what you will probably be going, and once you go past level 25 and going higher into the levels, you're probably going to unlock things based on what you will require, based on what gear you have and what path you want to take and how difficult the game will be for you. And lastly, once you get to level 15, you will unlock enchantments, which is basically the core mechanic of the sorcerer, specifically only to sorcerers, that you can choose one spell to turn into a passive as well. So almost all of your spells have a particular effect if you put them as an enchantment, which is at level 15 and at level 30 unlocked, which is a secret, let's say, special separate passive. And the one that you will be using for this build is the Hydra passive, which lets you summon an extra Hydra once you consume or spend 300 mana, bar any changes or tuning that comes into the future. This is to get a lot of extra Hydras, which is really good for the boss playstyles that I will go through. And of course, in terms of the actual playstyles, the way you want to engage combat is by first popping 2 of your Hydras, because you can do one baseline, you can do the second from your legendary, and you can consume the rest of your mana with Chain Lightning, eventually getting to that 300 mana to pop your third Hydra. And during this course, you'll obviously reposition Hydras as you're moving, or as the pack is moving, or as you reposition. You will use Ice Armor when you're out of mana, specifically if you have to just sit still and spam Arclight, because Arclight is a pretty short range and you cannot really kite spam, although you can kind of do it. But if you do have to sit still and cast, that's probably when you use Ice Armor, although of course Ice Armor can be good when you're dumping a lot of your mana, since it will fill that barrier shield absorb thing on you as well. Although if you do have a lot of mana, you can probably cast a Chain Lightning, and as it's doing his damage, keep stuttering and just cast it again and just keep on the move, because that's kind of how you play hardcore. You never really want to give the monsters any chance to hit you at all. You can also use Inferno on big packs or strong elites. Obviously it does a lot of damage, but also really good once you put the upgrade point into it, which I actually haven't mentioned, but it is actually very good. It pulls enemy towards the center, giving you that crowd control, and this is really good to, you know, kind of make sure that you're not running out of space. As a hardcore Diablo player, if you have played hardcore in the past, you know that some of the worst situations that you can find yourself in is when you're getting surrounded or when there's like nowhere else to run, and using Inferno to kind of make some space is actually really good. And lastly, of course, teleporting for positioning or getting out of crowd control is pretty much your savior in this situation, and this is how the baseline playstyle is for this spec. I have had almost 100% success with it. I don't think there was any situation where I found this build was lacking. Sometimes it's kind of sucky if you don't have all of the legendaries, especially the Hydra one. You'll start to really feel the lack of the damage, so maybe until you get some of these legendaries, you can put points into other one of the bonus abilities that I mentioned, so that you don't have to invest into something like Hydra if you don't have the legendary that enables you to have a second Hydra. But it's still really good, and the way you play it, obviously, as you've seen from the footage, you just kind of kite around and make sure that things don't hit you. You have a lot of range of movement, you have a lot of control over the battlefield, and it is very safe to play, which is probably what most people will be looking to when they play hardcore. Hope you enjoyed it. Have fun wrecking and smashing some monsters in Diablo, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.